The air inside the Yolo County Superior Court was thick with a tension that 15-year-old Daniel Marsh seemed entirely unable to comprehend. Clad in a standard jumpsuit, the teenager looked less like the architect of a nightmare and more like a high school student awaiting detention. A cognitive dissonance that was shattered the moment he posed a single naive question regarding when he would be released to go home. To the seasoned detectives and legal counsel present, the query demonstrated a terrifying pathological detachment from reality. Marsh was not facing a minor delinquency charge for truancy. He was standing trial for the savage, thrill-seeking mutilation of Oliver Northup and Claudia Maupin, an elderly couple murdered in their Davis, California bedroom. As the proceedings unfolded, the courtroom was forced to reconcile the boy's soft features with the forensic reality of a crime scene marked by absolute brutality and premeditation. The juvenile disconnect collided violently with the judicial system when Judge David Rosenberg delivered the final assessment. There would be no return to normalcy, no parents picking him up, and no going home. As the sentence of 52 years to life was handed down, the query that had once signaled teenage ignorance transformed into a chilling marker of a life officially forfeited to the state. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. The city of Davis, California, presents itself to the world as a sanctuary of safety and suburban tranquility. Known as the bicycle capital of America, it is a university town located west of Sacramento, where the streets are lined with sycamores and the crime rate remains statistically negligible. It is the sort of community where residents leave their windows cracked open to catch the Delta breeze, secure in the assumption that the darkness of the wider world stops at the city limits. In the years leading up to 2013, this assumption held firm, masking the reality that a profound malignancy was growing within one of its own quiet cul-de-sacs. This was the environment that shaped Daniel Marsh, a boy who would eventually shatter the town's innocence, though the warning signs of the coming storm were visible to those who knew where to look, scattered like debris in the wake of a slow-moving psychological collapse. Born in May 1997, Daniel Marsh was not a child of neglect in the traditional sense, but rather a product of a distinct emotional fracturing. He was the son of Bill Marsh, a respected local radio personality and reporter known for his boisterous voice and public presence. To the outside observer, the family appeared grounded, entrenched in the middle-class stability that defined Davis. However, the domestic facade began to crumble in 2008 when Daniel was 11 years old. His parents entered into a bitter and contentious divorce, a rupture that served as the initial catalyst for Daniel's descent. The separation was not amicable. It was fueled by accusations and acrimony that placed Daniel and his sister in the center of a psychological tug-of-war. As the family unit disintegrated, Daniel's internal landscape began to darken. By his early teenage years, the boy who had once been a Cub Scout and a member of the local swim team began to exhibit behaviors that transcended typical adolescent rebellion. The first major clinical manifestation of his distress appeared not as aggression toward others, but as aggression toward himself. In the 8th grade, Daniel developed severe anorexia nervosa. This was not driven by vanity, but by a desperate need for control. In clinical evaluations later conducted by court-appointed psychologists, it was noted that Daniel used starvation as a mechanism to numb his emotions. The physical deprivation provided a singular focus that quieted the chaotic noise of his parents fighting and his own emerging intrusive thoughts. The anorexia was severe enough to require intense medical intervention. Daniel was hospitalized, marking his first significant entry into the mental health system. During this period, the starvation had ravaged his body, but it was his mind that concerned clinicians the most. He was prescribed Zoloft, a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor intended to treat depression and anxiety. While the medication and therapy helped restore his weight, the underlying pathology remained untouched. As his physical strength returned, the passive self-destruction of anorexia metamorphosed into active, externalized rage. The quiet boy who refused to eat was replaced by a teenager consumed by violent ideation. By the time Daniel entered Davis High School, he had become a master of compartmentalization. To his teachers and casual acquaintances, he was an average student, perhaps a bit awkward, but articulate and intelligent. He joined the band and navigated the social hierarchy with a detached proficiency. He even harbored ambitions of becoming a hero, frequently telling adults that he wanted to join the FBI or become a firefighter. This hero complex, however, was a mirror image of his darker impulses. Psychologists later analyzed this duality, suggesting that his fascination with first responders was actually a fascination with tragedy and death, sanitized by a socially acceptable career path. He wanted to be close to the carnage, and whether he was the savior or the perpetrator was a distinction that became increasingly blurred in his mind. Behind the closed door of his bedroom, the mask slipped completely. Daniel began spending hours on the internet, but he was not engaging in the typical digital social life of a millennial teenager. He was hunting for gore. His browser history became a catalogue of atrocity. He frequented shock sites that hosted videos of decapitations, torture, and actual murders. He didn't just watch these videos, he studied them. He became desensitized to human suffering, viewing the destruction of the body with clinical detachment rather than horror. This consumption of violent media fed a growing hunger within him, a sensation he would later describe to investigators as an almost physical need, like an itch that scratched at the back of his brain. The escalation from digital voyeurism to physical action followed a textbook trajectory of sociopathic development. The family dog became a target. Daniel did not just mistreat the animal, he tormented it. He would later admit to deriving pleasure from the dog's fear, realizing that he held the power to inflict pain. This cruelty expanded to stray animals in the neighborhood. In the dense shrubbery and green belts that wove through Davis, Daniel began to experiment. He trapped a stray cat, not to keep as a pet, but to test his capacity for violence. He strangled the animal, watching the life drain from its eyes, an act he later described with chilling indifference. This was a rehearsal, a testing of boundaries to see if the act of killing would satisfy the urge that had replaced his anorexia. His mental state was further complicated by his relationship with his father. Bill Marsh suffered a stroke, an event that left him physically diminished and added another layer of stress to Daniel's life. The father he had once looked up to was now vulnerable, and Daniel's respect curdled into contempt. He began to view emotional connections as weaknesses. Simultaneously, his mother, concerned by his anger and isolation, sought further counseling for him. Daniel attended sessions with therapists, but he treated these encounters as intellectual games. He learned the language of therapy, telling clinicians what they wanted to hear to ensure he wasn't hospitalized again. He discussed his depression, but carefully omitted the violent fantasies that were consuming his waking thoughts. He spoke of sadness, concealing the homicidal rage. In the months leading up to his 15th birthday, Daniel's life seemed to stabilize briefly due to a romantic relationship. He had a girlfriend, a connection that tethered him to humanity. For a short time, the violent urges receded, held in check by the validation and intimacy of the relationship. However, this stability was fragile, built on the dependency of an unstable mind. When the relationship began to falter in early 2013, the dam broke. The breakup was not just a teenage heartbreak for Daniel. It was the removal of the final barrier between his fantasies and reality. He felt rejected, humiliated, and untethered. The anger that followed was total and all-consuming. It was during this period that Daniel began to formulate a concrete plan. He didn't just want to hurt someone. He wanted to execute a perfect crime. He began to curate what he called a toolkit, both literal and metaphorical. He obsessed over knives, researching blade types and the anatomy of the human body. He fantasized about torture, imagining scenarios where he would hold total dominion over another person's life. He began carrying a knife with him, concealing it in his waistband or his backpack, walking the halls of Davis High School with a lethal secret pressed against his skin. He would later recount sitting in class, looking at the necks of the students in front of him, visualizing the anatomy of the jugular vein and the carotid artery, calculating the force required to sever them. The warning signs were blindingly bright in retrospect, yet invisible in the moment. His mother knew he was troubled, noting his explosive temper and his obsession with fire. Another part of the dark triad of serial offender psychology. He would light fires in the backyard, staring into the flames with the same intensity he directed at his gore videos. Friends noticed he was moody and sometimes made disturbing jokes, but they wrote it off as dark humor, a coping mechanism for his family troubles. The school system saw a student who was struggling but passing, a boy who had been treated for depression but seemed to be managing. No one connected the dots between the anorexia, the animal cruelty, the obsession with gore, and the facade of the future FBI agent. By April 2013, Daniel Marsh was 15 years old and living on the precipice. He was medicated with Zoloft, which he later claimed numbed his conscience rather than his depression, stripping away the anxiety that might have acted as a brake on his impulses. He was angry at his ex-girlfriend, angry at his parents, and bored with the mundane reality of Davis. The urge to kill had transitioned from a fantasy to an imperative. He spoke of a zone, a dissociative state, where the moral laws of the universe ceased to apply, and he became the sole arbiter of life and death. He spent his nights wandering the quiet streets of his neighborhood, dressed in dark clothing, watching houses, testing doors, peering through windows. He was hunting, though he had not yet selected his prey. The community slept, protected by the illusion of safety, unaware that the boy next door had already crossed the threshold from troubled adolescent to budding predator, and that the only question remaining was not if he would strike, but when. The psychological evaluation was complete. The rehearsal with the animals was finished. Daniel Marsh was ready to graduate to human targets. The morning of Tuesday, November 30th, 2021, began with a chilling precursor to violence that would later be dissected by forensic psychologists and criminal investigators for years to come. In Oxford, Michigan, the temperature hovered near freezing as 15-year-old Ethan Crumbley prepared for a day of school. Inside his backpack, nestled amongst textbooks and assignments, was a 9mm Sig Sauer SP 2022 semi-automatic pistol, a weapon purchased by his father, James Crumbley, only 4 days prior. The presence of the firearm was not a matter of impulse, but of calculation, a tangible artifact of a deterioration that had been documented in journals and text messages for months. The timeline of the tragedy began to accelerate at approximately 8:02 a.m. Ethan sat in his first period class, but his focus was not on the curriculum. A teacher, looking over the teenager's shoulder, noticed him viewing images of ammunition on his cell phone. This observation triggered the first disciplinary intervention of the day, a report sent to school administrators that unfortunately did not result in an immediate search of his belongings. Instead, the warning was logged, and the day proceeded. By second period, the internal dialogue of the 15-year-old had manifested physically on a math worksheet. The worksheet, later recovered as a primary piece of evidence, contained drawings that depicted a semi-automatic handgun, a bullet, and a person bleeding from bullet wounds. Alongside the violent imagery were scribbled phrases that offered a window into a fracturing psyche. The thoughts won't stop. Help me. Blood everywhere, and my life is useless. These were not subtle cries for help, but declarative statements of intent. The discovery of this note by a teacher led to Ethan's removal from the classroom and his transport to the guidance counselor's office, clutching the backpack that contained the weapon. At 10:00 a.m., a critical meeting took place in the office of school counselor Sean Hopkins. Also present was the Dean of Students, Nicholas Ejak. Ethan had altered the drawing by the time the adults viewed it, scratching out the gun and the bleeding figure in a clumsy attempt to sanitize the threat, yet the words remained visible. The school summoned James and Jennifer Crumbly. When the parents arrived, they were presented with the disturbing drawings and the teacher's concerns. During this roughly 15-minute interval, the backpack sat near Ethan's feet. Despite the specific drawing of a gun, neither the school officials nor the parents opened the bag. The meeting concluded with a directive for the parents to seek immediate counseling for their son within 48 hours. James and Jennifer Crumbly declined to take Ethan home that day, citing work obligations. At approximately 10:55 a.m., the parents left the building. Ethan Crumbly was issued a pass to return to class. For the next 2 hours, the 15-year-old sat in the school environment, a setting he had already mentally dismantled in his journal. He attended classes, carrying the lethal contraband through the hallways, surrounded by the very students he had fantasized about eliminating. The bell for the change of classes rang, signaling the beginning of a passing period. At 12:51 p.m., Ethan entered a men's bathroom. He was inside for less than 2 minutes. Surveillance footage from the hallway outside the bathroom captured the transition from student to active shooter. At approximately 12:52 p.m., Ethan Crumbly exited the bathroom. He had removed the Sig Sauer from his backpack. There was no hesitation, no verbal warning, and no specific target acquisition based on grievance. The selection was indiscriminate. He raised the weapon and began firing at students who were in the immediate vicinity. The acoustic signature of the 9mm rounds shattered the ambient noise of the hallway. The first victim was struck almost instantly. Panic radiated outward from the epicenter of the gunfire. Students froze, then fled. The shooter moved with a methodical, predatory pace, not running, but walking, firing aimed shots. Within minutes, the north wing of the high school became a casualty zone. 16-year-old Tate Meyer, a standout football player and honor student, was in the hallway. Evidence suggests Meyer moved toward the danger rather than away from it, potentially attempting to close the distance to the shooter. He was struck 4 times and fell, succumbing to catastrophic injuries within moments. 14-year-old Hannah St. Juliana was shot and killed nearby. 17-year-old Madison Baldwin was targeted and killed as the shooter moved through the corridor. 17-year-old Justin Schilling would be the fourth fatality, shot later in a bathroom where he was cornered. The active shooting phase lasted roughly 5 minutes. In that brief window, Ethan Crumbley fired more than 30 rounds. The layout of the school turned into a chaotic labyrinth of locked doors and barricaded classrooms. Teachers, adhering to active shooter protocols known as Alice training, secured students in corners, armed themselves with scissors and calculators, and silenced their phones. The shooter approached several classroom doors, pulling handles and reportedly announcing himself as a sheriff's deputy in an attempt to lure students out, a tactic that failed due to the skepticism of those inside. By 12:56 p.m., the first calls to 911 had already flooded the Oakland County Dispatch. Law enforcement response was rapid. Deputies from the Oakland County Sheriff's Office arrived on the scene while the gunfire was still echoing. As they entered the building, moving toward the sound of the shots, they encountered the shooter in the hallway. Upon seeing the officers, Ethan Crumbley did not engage them in a firefight. He stopped. He raised his hands and knelt, placing the handgun on the floor. He was taken into custody without incident. The transition from an active threat to a compliant detainee was jarringly instant, marking the beginning of the detachment that would puzzle investigators. The immediate aftermath outside the school was a tableau of modern American tragedy. Hundreds of students streamed out of the exits into the parking lot and toward a nearby grocery store, acting as a reunification point. The air was filled with the sirens of ambulances and police cruisers. Inside, paramedics were conducting triage, determining who could be saved and who could not. The bodies of Tate Meyer, Hannah St. Juliana, Madison Baldwin, and Justin Schilling remained where they fell, creating a crime scene of devastating scope. 7 others, including a teacher, were wounded, some critically. While the physical investigation began with the cataloguing of shell casings and the securing of the weapon, the psychological investigation began in the back of a police cruiser. Ethan was transported to the Oakland County Sheriff's substation. He was placed in an interrogation room, a stark, windowless box designed to extract truth through pressure and isolation. It was here that the teenager's demeanor began to diverge sharply from the gravity of his actions. Detectives fitted him with shackles, securing his ankle to the floor. Dressed in a white Tyvek suit to preserve forensic evidence on his clothing, Ethan sat alone. The video recording of his time in the interrogation room reveals a subject who appeared vacuous rather than remorseful. There was no hysteria, no weeping, and no manic energy often associated with an adrenaline dump following extreme violence. Instead, he appeared bored. When detectives entered the room, they attempted to establish a baseline. They offered him water. They asked basic biographical questions. Ethan answered with a flat effect, his voice monotone. He did not ask about the condition of the students he had shot. He did not inquire about the number of fatalities. His concerns were bizarrely trivial and self-centered. He complained about the temperature of the room. He expressed concern about his future, but not in the context of a life sentence. He seemed to lack the capacity to project the legal consequences of his actions onto his reality. Simultaneously, in an adjacent room, his parents, James and Jennifer Crumbley, were being interviewed. The contrast was stark. The parents were defensive. Their panic centered on the realization of their own potential liability and the destruction of their lives. When the detectives informed them that they needed to seize the parents' cell phones as evidence, the focus of James and Jennifer shifted immediately to their own legal protection. They did not ask to see their son. They did not ask to comfort him. They retained counsel and invoked their rights. Back in the interrogation room, the 15-year-old sat in silence for long stretches. At one point, he began to exhibit behaviors that suggested a complete break from the enormity of the situation. He played with his hands. He looked around the room with idle curiosity. The concept of going home seemed to hover in the subtext of his compliance. His cooperation with the handcuffing and his polite tone with the officers suggested a mindset where the shooting was an event that had concluded, and now he was simply waiting for the administrative process to finish so he could return to a semblance of normalcy. The police interrogation was cut short when an attorney retained by his parents intervened, advising him to remain silent. However, the non-verbal communication captured on camera spoke volumes. The teenager, who had just executed 4 peers and wounded 7 others, displayed a pathological calmness. He was not a cornered animal. He was a void. As the afternoon wore on, the investigation team began to piece together the digital footprint that would explain the detachment. A search warrant executed on his phone, and social media accounts revealed a video recorded the night before. In it, Ethan explicitly outlined his plan to kill everyone at the school. He spoke of his desire for notoriety and his intent to become the most famous school shooter in history. The journal found in his backpack corroborated this, detailing a desire for blood and a hatred for the world. The detachment witnessed in the interrogation room was not shock. It was the manifestation of a persona he had cultivated, a nihilistic observer of his own violence. The disconnect between the crime and the suspect's reaction culminated in the processing phase. As he was fingerprinted and photographed, he followed instructions with mechanical precision. There was no resistance. The officers processing him noted that he seemed like a child who had been sent to the principal's office for a minor infraction, rather than a mass murderer facing terrorism charges. Later that evening, as the news broke nationwide and the faces of the victims were broadcast across the world, Ethan Crumbley sat in a juvenile holding cell. The gravity of the judicial hammer was about to fall. The prosecutor, Karen MacDonald, would soon announce an unprecedented move, charging the 15-year-old as an adult with 4 counts of first-degree murder and terrorism causing death. Furthermore, she would announce charges against his parents, James and Jennifer, for involuntary manslaughter, citing their gross negligence in buying the gun and failing to intervene. The answer that left him speechless was not a single sentence delivered in a dramatic courtroom moment on that first day, but rather the cumulative realization of the legal machinery that had entrapped him. The arraignment, which took place via video feed, showed a teenager seemingly shrinking into his safety vest. When the judge read the charges, murder, terrorism, assault with intent to murder, and denied bond, the reality began to encroach on the detachment. The routine of school, the comfort of his bedroom, and the presence of his parents were instantly and permanently excised from his existence. The investigation continued to churn through the night. Crime scene technicians at Oxford High School placed evidence markers next to hundreds of bullet fragments. They traced the trajectory of shots that went through doors and walls. They catalogued the blood trails that marked the desperate flight of the victims. In the sheriff's office, investigators reviewed the timeline, the drawing at 10:01 a.m., the refusal to take him home, the shooting at 12:51 p.m. The window of opportunity to prevent the tragedy had been open for hours, and it had been closed by a series of failures. The interrogation of the parents revealed that upon hearing reports of an active shooter, Jennifer Crumbly had texted her son, "Ethan, don't do it." James Crumbly had raced home to check for the gun, found it missing, and called 911 to report his son as the likely shooter. These actions confirmed that the parents were aware of the volatility of their son and his access to the weapon, yet they had left him in the school environment. This element added a layer of culpability that would drive the investigation toward the parents as accomplices to the negligence that allowed the massacre to occur. As the sun set on Oxford, Michigan, the community began the long, agonizing process of grief. Vigils were planned. A makeshift memorial began to grow at the school sign. But inside the detention facility, the 15-year-old suspect remained an enigma of detachment. The day had begun with a plea for help on a math worksheet and ended with the complete destruction of 4 families and the permanent scarring of a community. The "when can I go home" sentiment, whether spoken or internalized, was the final delusion of a mind that had retreated so far into violent fantasy that the permanent reality of a concrete cell was the only thing capable of shattering the illusion. The doors locked, the lights dimmed, and the 15-year-old was left alone with the silence of the aftermath. The air in the Miami-Dade County courtroom was thick, not just with the residual humidity of the Florida heat outside, but with a palpable, suffocating tension that had been building for 4 years. It was the sentencing phase for Michael Hernandez, a proceeding that would determine whether a teenager would ever breathe free air again. The gallery was packed, a sea of somber faces divided by an invisible line. On one side, the family of Jaime Goff, the victim, clutching photographs and rosaries. On the other, the parents of the defendant, their faces etched with a different kind of grief, the agonizing realization that their son was a stranger to them. The wood paneling of the courtroom seemed to absorb the whispers, leaving only the sharp click of the court reporter's machine and the rustling of legal briefs. Judge David Young sat elevated on the bench, his expression unreadable behind his glasses. He had presided over the trial where the details of the crime had been laid bare with clinical, gruesome precision. The bathroom stall at Southwood Middle School, the lure of a friend, and the cold-blooded execution that had taken place. But today was not about the act itself. It was about the consequence. It was about the question of whether a boy who committed a crime at 14 could be redeemed, or if he was so fundamentally broken that society required his permanent removal. The defense team, led by attorney Richard Rosenbaum, looked weary. They had spent the duration of the trial attempting to paint Hernandez not as a monster, but as a sick child, a boy whose grip on reality had slipped so profoundly that he did not understand the permanence of death or the severity of his punishment. The proceedings began with the final evidentiary arguments regarding sentencing guidelines. The prosecution, led by the formidable Gail Levine, moved with the precision of a surgeon. She called witnesses to reinforce the premeditation, the list of names found in Michael's journal, and the chilling normalcy with which he had returned to class after the murder. Levine's argument was rooted in the concept of public safety and retribution. She argued that age was merely a number when the crime demonstrated the sophistication of a seasoned killer. She projected images of the crime scene, forcing the courtroom to confront the reality of what had happened in that middle school restroom. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the stifled sobs of Maria Goff, Jaime's mother. In stark contrast, the defense called upon psychological experts to testify to the defendant's mental state. Dr. Philomene Wana-Gill took the stand, her voice steady as she described a boy living in a delusion. This was the crux of the defense's plea for leniency, the assertion that Michael Hernandez was operating under a profound disconnect from reality. It was during this testimony that the courtroom drama reached a fever pitch. The defense recounted the moments immediately following Michael's arrest and throughout the competency hearings. They described a teenager who, despite facing charges of first-degree murder, seemed more concerned with the mundane trivialities of his interrupted school day than the life sentence hanging over his head. The defense attorney moved to the podium, his voice lowering to a register of pleading earnestness. He recounted the interactions he had with his client, painting a picture of a child trapped in a terrifying psychological limbo. He turned to the judge, gesturing toward the slight figure of Hernandez sitting at the defense table. The boy looked younger than his years, clean-cut, wearing a suit that seemed slightly too large, emphasizing his physical immaturity. The attorney detailed the chilling yet pitiable conversations they had held in the holding cell. He explained that throughout the grueling process of the trial, amidst the talk of life without parole and lethal injections, Michael had remained strangely detached, his affect flat and unemotional. It was then that the defense played their most emotional card, referencing the specific, infamous inquiry that highlighted this disconnect. The attorney described a moment where, after hours of explaining the legal gravity of the situation, that the state was seeking to lock him away until he died, Michael had looked up with genuine confusion and asked the question that would haunt the proceedings. He had asked, with the innocence of a student who had merely been sent to the principal's office, about when he could go home. He was worried about missing a math test. He was concerned about his perfect attendance record. The lawyer emphasized that this was not the bravado of a hardened criminal, but the confusion of a 15-year-old whose mind could not grasp the concept of forever. The question, "When can I go home?" hung in the air, a testament to the defense's theory that the boy before them was mentally incapable of processing the horror he had caused. The reaction in the courtroom was visceral. The prosecution rolled their eyes, seeing it as a manipulation, a convenient act of insanity. But for a moment, the observers were forced to reconcile the image of the killer with the image of a naive child asking a question that implied he thought this was all a temporary inconvenience. The defense argued that sentencing such a detached mind to life in prison was not justice, but a cruelty that ignored the potential for psychiatric rehabilitation. They pleaded for a sentence that offered a glimmer of hope, a chance for the boy to receive treatment and perhaps, decades down the line, return to the world he was so desperate to go home to. Following the defense, the court heard the victim impact statements, the emotional climax of the morning. Jaime Gouff's father, Jorge, took the stand. He was a man composed of sorrow, his voice trembling as he spoke of the empty chair at their dinner table, the silence in their home, and the dreams for his son that had been extinguished in a bathroom stall. He spoke directly to the judge, bypassing the legal jargon to touch upon the raw human cost. He acknowledged the defense's argument about Michael's age and his naive questions about going home, but he countered it with a devastating reality. Jaime would never go home. Jaime would never worry about a math test again. The symmetry of the tragedy was brutal. If the killer wanted to go home, the victim's father argued, he should have thought of that before he denied another child the right to ever go home again. As the impact statements concluded, the atmosphere in the room shifted from sorrow to anticipation. It was time for Judge David Young to speak. The shuffling in the gallery ceased. Even the court officers seemed to stand straighter. Hernandez stood up, flanked by his attorneys. His face remained largely impassive, a mask that had frustrated observers throughout the trial. Was he medicated? Was he dissociating? Or was he simply empty? The question of his going home query lingered. Was he still waiting for the answer? Judge Young adjusted his robes and looked down at the defendant. His demeanor was not one of anger, but of a heavy, judicial solemnity. He began by addressing the legal arguments, dissecting the defense's plea of insanity and the narrative of the naive child. He acknowledged the testimony regarding Michael's disconnect, the questions about school, and the apparent lack of understanding regarding the sentence. However, the judge's tone began to harden as he pivoted to the facts of the crime itself. He recounted the planning. He spoke of the knife hidden in the backpack. He spoke of the failed attempt to kill another student earlier that same morning, and the cold calculation required to pivot to Jamie Goof as a secondary target. The judge leaned forward, his voice projecting clearly to the back of the room. He addressed the "when can I go home" question directly, dismantling it not as proof of insanity, but as evidence of a narcissistic detachment that made the defendant dangerous. He argued that the ability to worry about a math test after slitting a throat did not show a lack of understanding of consequences, but a terrifying prioritization of the self over the value of human life. The judge noted that while the defendant was legally a juvenile at the time of the crime, the act was committed with the precision of an adult executioner. The law, he explained, must protect society from those who treat murder with the casualness of a skipped class. The tension ratcheted up as the judge moved toward the final pronouncement. He spoke of the purpose of sentencing: punishment, deterrence, and protection of the community. He looked at Michael Hernandez, who stood blinking under the fluorescent lights, perhaps still harboring that sliver of delusion that the system would correct itself, that his age would be a shield, that he would return to his bedroom and his video games. The defense counsel placed a hand on Michael's shoulder, bracing for the impact they knew was coming. Then came the sentence. Judge Young's voice did not waver. He declared that for the count of first-degree murder, the court was sentencing Michael Hernandez to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words landed like physical blows. Life without parole. It was an absolute crushing finality. There would be no going home. There would be no math tests. There would be no graduation. The answer to the 15-year-old's question was a resounding, permanent negative. But the judge was not finished. He continued, stacking the sentences for the attempted murder of the other student, adding another 30 years to the life sentence, ensuring that even if laws changed, even if loopholes were found, Michael Hernandez would never walk free. The clinical precision of the sentencing stripped away any ambiguity. The judge described the sentence as a necessary quarantine for a soul that lacked the basic machinery of empathy. The reaction from the defendant was the moment the entire room had been waiting for, the climax of the narrative arc. As the words "life without parole" echoed, the mask slipped. For the first time, the "when can I go home" delusion shattered against the hard rock of judicial reality. Hernandez's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He blinked rapidly, his eyes darting from his attorney to the judge, and then, for a brief second, to his parents in the gallery. He did not scream. He did not cry out. He was rendered utterly speechless. The color drained from his face, leaving him looking waxy and small. It was the look of someone watching a door slam shut and lock from the outside, the realization dawning that the room he was in was now the whole world. Beside him, his mother collapsed into her husband's arms, her wail piercing the silence that the judge's gavel had commanded. The Guff family, conversely, remained stoic, tears streaming silently, clutching each other's hands until the knuckles turned white. They had received justice, but it was a heavy, somber victory. The judge concluded the proceedings, ordering the defendant to be remanded to the custody of the Department of Corrections immediately. Court officers moved in, the jingle of handcuffs, breaking the trance. Hernandez turned as he was led away, his movement mechanical. He looked back one last time, not at the judge, but at the open doors of the courtroom leading to the hallway, the path to the outside world, the path home. That path was now guarded by armed deputies. The realization seemed to hit him in a wave of physical weakness. He stumbled slightly before being steadied by the guard. The naive question he had asked, "When can I go home?" had been answered with a silence more deafening than any scream. He was going to a house, but it was the big house, and he was never leaving. As the side door clicked shut behind the defendant, swallowing him into the labyrinth of the correction system, the courtroom began to exhale. The reporters rushed for the doors to file their stories. The attorneys began packing their briefcases, the adrenaline fading into exhaustion. The tragedy of the case was complete. 2 lives were effectively over. One ended in a bathroom stall, the other extinguished by a pen stroke on a sentencing order. The narrative of the boy who wanted to go home had ended in the harsh, concrete reality of an adult prison, leaving behind only the memory of a question that laid bare the terrible, tragic gap between the mind of a child and the actions of a killer. The verdict delivered in the case of State of Florida versus Michael Hernandez did more than seal the fate of a teenager. It marked the beginning of a complex, decades-long legal odyssey that would test the boundaries of the American justice system regarding juvenile offenders. When Hernandez was first escorted out of the courtroom, the naive boy who had once famously asked a detective if he could go home because he had school the next day was gone. In his place stood a convicted murderer facing a mandatory sentence of life without the possibility of parole. The initial shock of the sentence resonated not just as a punishment for the brutal stabbing of his friend Jamie Goff in a middle school bathroom, but as a total erasure of his future. The cell door closing at the intake facility provided the silent, devastating answer to his earlier question. Never. For the family of Jamie Goff, the verdict was supposed to be the final chapter, a closure to the horrific narrative that began in a restroom stall at Southwood Middle School in 2004. Jorge and Maria Goff, Jamie's parents, had sat stoically through the recounting of how their son was lured and executed. With the sentence handed down, they attempted to rebuild a life defined by absence. However, the legacy of the Hernandez trial would not remain static. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling in Miller v. Alabama, declaring that mandatory life sentences without parole for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional. The ruling was grounded in neuroscience and behavioral psychology, arguing that the adolescent brain, specifically the prefrontal cortex responsible for impulse control and consequence evaluation, is not fully developed until the mid-20s. This legal pivot meant that offenders like Hernandez, who were minors at the time of their crimes, were entitled to resentencing hearings to determine if their crimes reflected transient immaturity or irreparable corruption. This legal shift reopened the wounds of the Goff family. Instead of the silence they had sought, they were thrust back into the courtroom in 2016, forced to relive the trauma of their son's murder to ensure his killer remained behind bars. The debate was no longer about guilt, but about the capacity for redemption. Defense attorneys argued that the Michael Hernandez of 2016 was not the delusional 14-year-old of 2004. They posited that the legal system must account for the plasticity of a young mind and the potential for rehabilitation. This period of the aftermath highlighted the agonizing friction between theoretical justice, which seeks to protect the rights of minors, and the visceral reality of victim impact. For Jorge and Maria Goff, the legal debates about brain development felt like an abstraction that insulted the permanence of their loss. The resentencing hearing, however, revealed that time had not tempered the offender's psyche in the way reform advocates might have hoped. Prosecutors presented chilling evidence from Hernandez's time in custody. While the defense painted a picture of a maturing young man, recorded jailhouse phone calls and intercepted correspondence painted a darker portrait. Hernandez had not spent his years in reflection or remorse. Instead, he had spent them studying the mechanics of murder. He was caught discussing weaponry and compiling lists of potential future victims, including the names of the prosecutors who had put him away. He spoke with a clinical detachment about cleaning up the world, mirroring the same disturbed ideology that had motivated the murder of Jaime Goff. The clinical precision of his ongoing, violent fantasies dismantled the argument for his release. In the eyes of the court, the evidence suggested that Hernandez fell into the rare category of juveniles whose crimes reflected permanent incorrigibility. The speechless reaction often attributed to his initial realization of consequences was replaced by a cold resignation. Judge John Schlesinger, weighing the new mandates of the Supreme Court against the specific facts of Hernandez's incarceration, reinstated the life sentence. The decision underscored a grim reality within the juvenile justice debate. While the law must allow for the possibility of change, it must also recognize when change has not occurred. Life behind bars for Hernandez became a monotonous loop of maximum security routine at the Columbia Correctional Institution. He remained isolated from the general population for long stretches, a necessary precaution given the notoriety of his case and his own behavioral profile. The years following the resentencing saw him age from a teenager into a man in his early 30s. Yet psychologically, he appeared frozen in the morbid fascinations of his adolescence. The debate surrounding his sentence continued in legal circles, serving as a case study for the limits of the Miller versus Alabama ruling. But for Hernandez, the legal maneuvering had reached a dead end. The final word in the legacy of the case came not from a judge, but from biology. In May 2021, at the age of 31, Michael Hernandez collapsed at the Columbia Correctional Institution. His death was sudden, attributed to a cardiac event resulting from undiagnosed health issues. The news brought a complicated wave of relief to the Goff family. For nearly 2 decades, they had lived with the background anxiety of appeals and hearings, the fear that the boy who asked to go home might one day actually be allowed to. His death provided the absolute finality that the court system could not guarantee. The legacy of the case remains a somber reference point in criminal law, illustrating the devastating collision between a child's capacity for evil and a justice system struggle to categorize it. The 15-year-old, who once thought he could return to class the next day, ultimately found his permanent home within the concrete walls of the state penitentiary, leaving behind a legacy defined not by rehabilitation, but by the enduring grief of the family he shattered. The final gavel strike by Judge Kwame Rowe in the Oakland County Circuit Court served as the definitive response to the naive query Ethan Crumbley posed to detectives shortly after his arrest. When the 15-year-old asked when he could go home, he displayed a profound detachment from the massacre he had just orchestrated at Oxford High School. The judicial answer, delivered after days of grueling testimony and the emotional devastation of victim impact statements, was absolute. Never. The sentence of life without the possibility of parole ensures that Crumbley will die within the confines of the Michigan Department of Corrections, transforming the teenager into a permanent ward of the state. This verdict does not merely punish a crime. It acknowledges the catastrophic loss of Madison Baldwin, Tate Meyer, Justin Schilling, and Hannah St. Juliana. Their futures were erased in seconds of calculated violence involving a 6-hour 9mm, creating a permanent deficit in the world that no legal remedy can restore. For the survivors and the families of the fallen, the courtroom proceedings offered a procedural end, yet the psychological scars remain open and raw. The tragedy is dual-faceted, encompassing the senseless destruction of innocent potential and the chilling reality that a child is capable of such irredeemable malice. The case of the Oxford High School shooter stands as a grim test of the principles established in Miller v. Alabama regarding the sentencing of juveniles. By determining that this specific offender is one of the rare juveniles whose crime reflects irreparable corruption rather than transient immaturity, the justice system drew a hard line in the sand. As the courtroom emptied and the reality of maximum security confinement settled in, the question of rehabilitation was silenced by the gravity of the offense. There is no return to the life he knew, no graduation, and no redemption. The only remaining certainty is the sterile, unchanging routine of prison life that stretches out before him, an endless answer to a question he will never need to ask again.